Rain lashed down on Neo-Kolvar's stacked housing blocks. Auditor Mira descended into gray sheets of water. Her uniform was a dull beacon of control in the city's medicated calm. She paused at a metal door with a flickering blue port light. "Mr. Kale," she called out, "this is Auditor Solvang." His sunken cheeks and bloodshot eyes told a tale of unpaid grief. Mira didn't need to see his face. She'd reviewed the telemetry. Baseline compliance was mandatory, and Mira would enforce it. Her job was order, not judgment or feeling. But something stirred in her as she approached with a disruptor. Cal's sob contorted mid-word, and his eyes went empty. Mira collected the emotional telemetry, packaged it with his account details. The cost of feeling begins in gray streets where love is bought and sold. Like and subscribe for more stories like this one. The rain lashed down in gray sheets, drumming against her hood as Mira descended through Neo-Kolvar's stacked housing blocks. She paused at a metal door with a flickering blue port light behind it, a subscriber overdue on his payments. "Mr. Kale," she called out, "this is Auditor Solvang." Her voice was toneless, her eyes already calculating the legalities and liabilities of what she was about to do. The door creaked open, and a man with sunken cheeks and bloodshot eyes stood in the gap. Mira didn't need to see his face. She'd reviewed the telemetry. He was defaulting on his grief, an unpaid funeral for his mother, and it would be repossessed within hours. "Please, don't take it back. Baseline compliance is mandatory," Mira stated, voice flat. She approached him with a neural disruptor in hand, ready to drain the grief from his port and send it back to Sentiva. Her job was to maintain order, not to judge or feel. Kale's face contorted mid-sob as she worked. His gray eyes went empty, and he slumped against the wall. Mira collected the emotional telemetry, packaged it with his account details, and closed her disruptor. The man's grief had been legally repossessed. She left him in a state of affective poverty, flatlined at baseline calm. The same condition she'd maintained for years to survive her job as an auditor, just existence, stripped of feeling. Back on the streets, Mira checked her handheld for the next case file. Alias Room, 340 minutes of parental love overdue. Her lips pursed. She'd reviewed his telemetry before, saw a man who sacrificed everything to purchase an hour's worth of love each week, only for it to be rationed and timed as if he could afford nothing more. She made her way through the drizzle to Rune's address, a cramped apartment in one of Neo-Kolvar's lower tiers. The door opened on a child with wide, calm eyes and dark hair pulled back in a severe bun. Sella, Elias's daughter, 8 years old and locked at baseline. "Mr. Rune is overdue on his parental love subscription," she stated, scanning her handheld to confirm the unpaid balance. "The account must be settled immediately or repossessed." Elias stood in the background, a gaunt man with sunken eyes and pallid skin. He glanced at Sella before answering, "I'll settle it. Just not today." His voice was tight, as if he were apologizing for needing love. Mira raised an eyebrow. Late fees accrued daily. Elias's delay would soon become unaffordable. But she noticed how Sella looked up to her father, and the child's placid expression seemed almost unnatural, like it had been practiced. Perhaps there was more to this case than unpaid emotion. She made a note on her handheld to revisit Elias Rune's file later. Rune's telemetry. Something about his daughter's cold demeanor bothered her. For now, she would allow him another day, but not much longer. The system demanded its due, and Mira was its uncompromising enforcer. With the file updated, she exited the apartment, stepping back into the rain-soaked streets of Neo-Kolvar. Her job awaited. There were others to audit, feelings to repossess. The city hummed around her, a serene, medicated quiet that concealed the true cost of human emotion, metered and controlled by Sentiva's patents. And Mira was its most effective tool in keeping it that way. For now, she felt nothing at all. But something deep within her stirred, a flicker of curiosity about Elias Rune's daughter, and the father who loved her enough to risk everything for a fleeting hour each week. It wasn't feeling yet, but it was a start. The elevator deposited Mira back in the drizzly streets, its metallic carapace hissing shut behind her. Neon lights reflected off rain-slicked pavement as she navigated through the vertical megacity's winding walkways. She walked with purpose, her black Sentiva uniform blending into the sea of Functionova fashion attire. Her handheld beeped. A message from HQ awaited. Elias Rune, 340 minutes parental love. SKU overdue for payment. Mira acknowledged receipt and filed it away. Another debt to collect, another family's feelings to repossess. The work was tedious but necessary. Without the strict enforcement of Sentiva's patents, neo-noir would descend into chaos. The city's history still haunted her, a mass suicide epidemic dubbed the Overwhelm. People couldn't cope with their emotions, they'd rather die than feel. That tragedy had led to the development of emotional throttling technology, patented by Sentiva Corporation. Now, every citizen wore a cortical port, which could be unlocked for specific feelings via metered subscriptions. Mira's handheld pinged again, this time a personal alert. Junko was online. She'd been trying to reach Mira all afternoon. A feeling dealer operating in the black market, Junko was Mira's most reliable informant on the city's illicit emotional trade. Their messages were brief and coded. They could never reveal their true identities. Junko's message read, Elias Rune desperate for off-grid parental love subscription. Bootleg SKU available tonight at 2300 in drainage tunnel beneath level 17. Mira frowned, her mind already processing the ramifications of Junko's offer. Elias would risk a felony by purchasing illegal feeling. He'd be buying it on the black market, where SKUs carried unpredictable bleed fragments of the original owner's emotions and memories. It was a gamble, but for a father trying to feel love for his daughter, it might seem worth the risk. Mira made her decision. She would not report Elias. Instead, she'd give him this chance at feeling. But she had to be careful. If Thea found out, he would punish her severely, possibly even repossess her own emotions. As night fell on neo-noir, Mira left the Sentiva building and made her way to the designated meeting spot in the drainage tunnel. The smell of waste and decay assaulted her senses as she descended into darkness. She could hear Junko's voice before she saw her, fast-paced, foul-mouthed, transactional. "Mira, late as usual," Junko said with a smirk as Mira joined them. Elias waited nervously in the shadows. His eyes pleaded for Junko to help him. "I have what you need," Junko told Elias, "but the price is steep. You'll owe me big time." She handed over an unlicensed parental love SKU, her fingers brushing against Elias's as she did so. There was a moment of unexpected tenderness in that contact, but Junko quickly masked it with a bitter laugh. Elias hesitated. He knew he was taking a huge risk. "How much?" he asked finally. Junko named a price that made Elias wince, but he had no choice. He handed over the credits and activated the SKU, feeling an illicit rush of love for his daughter flood through him. Mira watched them exchange currency and codes, her detachment slipping ever so slightly. She could relate to Elias's desperation. In fact, she felt it herself, buried deep beneath the numbness Sentiva had engineered into her. The thought sent a shiver down her spine. Was she beginning to feel something again? Junko noticed Mira's hesitation and nudged her closer with an elbow. "Hey, Auditor," she said quietly. "You're starting to show cracks in your armor." Mira turned to stare at Junko, annoyance and fear warring within her. She forced herself back into professional mode, the mask that hid how much she was beginning to care about a feeling dealer and a debt-drowned father who bought love for his child. "Don't flatter yourself," Mira replied curtly. "Doing your job, huh? Then tell me, why didn't you report Elias like any good little auditor would?" Mira hesitated. She hadn't expected this line of questioning from Junko. She glanced at Elias, who was already making his way back into the night. "I'll do my job," Mira said finally, "but I'm not going to punish a man for loving his daughter." Junko's eyes narrowed, but she nodded in acceptance. For now, They had an uneasy truce, auditor and feeling dealer united against Sentiva's stranglehold on human emotion. As Junko disappeared into the darkness with her unlicensed skews, Mira couldn't shake off the creeping suspicion that this was just the beginning of a much larger web of deceit and desire in Neo-Kolvar. She had no choice but to keep digging, and possibly start feeling something again in the process. The night air clung damp and cool against Mira's skin as she made her way back to Sentiva's central offices. Neon signs reflected off the wet pavement, casting an eerie glow on the rain-slicked streets of Neo-Kolvar. She was late. The scheduled audit would commence in 20 minutes, tops. Normally this wouldn't have fazed her. Mira had seen it all and felt nothing much of anything anymore. But tonight, something gnawed at her. Those gray, empty eyes of Elias's daughter, Sela. Mira pushed through Sentiva's gleaming glass doors, the familiar hum of medicated calm enveloping her like a shroud. She passed by the check-in kiosk and punched in her code, bypassing the line of baseline compliance citizens waiting for their scheduled audits. The elevators whisked her up to the executive floor with unnatural speed. She entered her office, lights flickering on as if welcoming her home. Mira's gaze drifted to the stack of files awaiting her attention. Elias Runes was at the top. She flipped it open, scanning his file again. A decade of love, bought by the minute. A father's desperation palpable in every word. The man wasn't a criminal. He was a parent trying to survive the system that had taken feeling away from them both. A chime pinged through the room. Mira glanced at her comm screen. Director Via wanted an update on Elias Rune's status. He would expect her to report the bootleg tap and initiate repossession proceedings immediately. But Mira hesitated, her mind replaying Junko's words. "Doing your job, huh? Then tell me, why didn't you report Elias like any good little auditor would?" Mira had danced around the truth long enough. It was time to decide. She locked eyes with her own reflection in the window, a face devoid of genuine emotion. For years now, she'd been numb to everything but the drudgery of her work. But something had stirred inside her since meeting Elias, a spark she hadn't felt in ages. Maybe it was the child's innocence. Maybe it was Junko's cynicism. Mira didn't know yet. She made up her mind with a resolute click of her tongue. Instead of reporting Elias to Ver, she'd log his case as pending verification. Just 72 more hours before Sentiva's system would automatically repossess his parental love SKU and lock it down for good if Mira didn't act first. She opened the Elias Rune file once more, fingers hovering over the audit protocol. The words blurred together, her mind raced with possibilities. What might happen to this family in those 72 hours? Would Elias find a way to buy back his daughter's affection? And what about Sela? Would she ever know the love of a parent who felt it freely? As Mira hesitated, a subtle tremor rippled through her body. It was almost imperceptible, just a twitch at the edge of awareness, but unmistakable. For an instant, she'd unlocked something within herself, a spark of curiosity that wasn't just procedural. The realization hit her like a slap to the face. She hadn't felt it in so long, had forgotten what genuine interest could do to her numbness. Mira's heart stuttered, and then resumed its usual steady beat. The world around her seemed sharper now, every sound magnified, each scent more potent. She took a deep breath, trying to settle herself back into the gray effective poverty that was her norm. But it was too late. Whatever had awoken inside her wouldn't be stilled so easily. Mira knew she could delay the audit report for 72 hours. But now that she felt something again, how long would she be able to stay numb? The question hung in the air like a challenge, one she couldn't quite accept yet. With a sense of urgency she couldn't explain, Mira began to type out her report. She logged Elias's case as pending verification and saved it before heading out into the night once more. As she walked back down the corridors, every step echoed with the weight of her decision. She'd given this family a reprieve, but at what cost to herself? Mira stepped out of Sentiva's executive wing and onto the rain-slicked streets of Neo-Kolvar. She was no stranger to the city's gray, medicated hush. It was her native environment, the one she'd been raised in since birth. Still, tonight it felt different somehow, as if the very air had thickened with a strange new texture. She made her way through the throngs of citizens moving about their business, each face placid and unremarkable, behind its port's soft blue glow. Mira herself was no exception. She'd learned to keep her own affect flat and controlled long ago. It had been years since she'd last felt anything genuine, not even the faintest flicker of emotion. As she walked, Mira reached into her jacket pocket and pulled out a small data chip containing Elias's audit file. She stared at it for a moment, the words and figures swimming in front of her eyes. This man, this stranger, had been accruing unpaid parental love minutes for years now. But Mira wasn't here to question the system. She was merely its instrument. Her job was to enforce compliance, to ensure that every citizen maintained their legal baseline calm. If Elias couldn't afford his love skew, then it was Sentiva's duty, and hers by extension, to repossess those unpaid minutes. Or so the official line went. In reality, Mira had seen enough cases like Elias's to know that the system was rigged against people like him. Those who could least afford to feel were forced into affective poverty, while the wealthy lived in a constant state of heightened sensation. It wasn't justice. It was an elaborate farce, one that Sentiva and its director, Halden Vare, seemed more than happy to perpetuate. Mira's thoughts were interrupted by the soft ping of her comms device. She glanced at the screen and frowned slightly. It was a message from Beer himself, requesting her presence in his office. What could he possibly want with her now? They'd only just finished the initial audit review. With a sense of trepidation, Mira made her way back to Sentiva's HQ. As she entered Vere's opulent office, she was immediately struck by its sterile, clinical atmosphere. Everything about it, from the cold, polished surfaces to the sparse art on the walls, seemed designed to elicit nothing but a sense of calm detachment. Vere looked up as she approached, his expression unreadable behind his glasses. "Mira," he said, his voice smooth and measured. "Thank you for coming." She nodded curtly, her hands clasped tightly in front of her. "Director Vere, what can I do for you?" He leaned back in his chair, steepling his fingers. "I've been reviewing your recent audit results," he began, "and I must say I'm impressed. Your efficiency is unmatched." Mira felt a flicker of pride at the compliment, but it was quickly doused by the knowledge that her success had nothing to do with any personal merit and everything to do with Sentiva's patented emotional throttling technology. "You're doing excellent work, Mira," Vere continued, "and I believe it's time you were rewarded for your efforts." He paused, allowing his words to hang in the air like a promise. Then he reached out and activated the small holographic display on his desk. A file opened and an image of Elias Rune filled the screen, along with a detailed breakdown of his unpaid parental love skew. "This man," Via said, pointing at the image, "has been accruing love minutes for years now. It's quite remarkable, really." Mira felt her heart rate increase slightly as she looked at the file. She knew Elias's case well by now. In fact, she'd spent hours reviewing his telemetry data, trying to understand what motivated him to keep buying love despite being unable to afford it. "What do you propose we do about Mr. Rune?" she asked, her voice steady despite the turmoil within her. Fair smiled, a thin, calculated line of lips. "I believe we should offer him a choice." "A choice?" "Yes," Vare said, leaning forward in his chair. "Mr. Rune can either continue to accumulate unpaid love minutes, risking repossession and potential emotional distress for himself and his daughter, or he can accept a full free subscription to Sentiva's emotional services package." Mira felt her breath catch in her throat. "What would you like me to do, Director?" she asked, her voice barely above a whisper. Vere stood up, his movements fluid and deliberate. "I want you to approach Mr. Rune with this offer," he said, his eyes boring into hers. "Make it clear that this is a rare opportunity, one that may never come again. And then, I want you to report back to me, Mira." He paused, allowing the full weight of his words to sink in. His story could serve as a powerful example, demonstrating the value of emotional control and regulation to our citizens. Mira felt her heart race at Vere's words. There was something more to this than just a simple audit or an offer of a free subscription. Elias's case had become so much more than that. It had become a test, one that would determine not only the fate of this man and his daughter, but also the future of. "So," Mira repeated, her voice still soft but with a hint of steel creeping in, "you want me to convince Elias Roon that accepting this offer is in his best interest, even though he can't afford it, and even if it means giving up his daughter's affectionate moments?" Bia nodded, his smile as smooth as ever. "Precisely," he said, leaning back into his chair. "And when you report back to me, I expect a detailed account of your conversation with Mr. Roon, including any resistance or hesitation on his part." Mira felt her jaw tighten at the implication. Veer wasn't just ordering her to persuade Elias. He wanted her to manipulate him, and if Elias refused, then Sentiva would find another way to seize control of their relationship. "And what about Sela?" she asked sharply. Veer's expression turned blandly sympathetic. "Sela is a minor," he said. "Her well-being will be monitored by the state, naturally." Mira felt a cold dread seep into her chest as Veer continued. "However, I anticipate that Mr. Roon's compliance with Sentiva's terms and his ability to provide for his daughter will be significantly enhanced once he accepts this offer." Mira's mind reeled at the thought, but she kept her features composed. "Director," she said evenly, "I understand your position, but I must remind you that Mr. Roon is a father, and fathers don't put a price on their children." Veer's smile never wavered. "Ah, Mira, you're beginning to sound like an advocate for them." He shook his head. "Sentiva isn't here to protect or preserve feelings. We're here to regulate them, make them accessible and affordable for all citizens, even those who cannot afford them outright." Mira's anger flared at the bold-faced hypocrisy, but she pushed it down. "I'll report back as instructed," she said finally. Veer nodded, his eyes glinting with satisfaction. "Excellent." He stood up, signaling that their meeting was at an end. "Now, go and convince Mr. Roon to make the right choice for himself and his daughter." Mira rose mechanically, her mind racing with conflicting thoughts and emotions as she exited Veer's office. She knew what she had to do, but doing it would mean betraying a father and his child. And yet, Elias had willingly purchased love at any price, hadn't he? For Sela's sake, he was willing to sell out his own feelings. As Mira walked through the Sentiva corridors, her thoughts turned back to Veer's words, and the offer still lingering on her mind, a free subscription to feeling. She could have it all, never be drained again. But at what cost? Elias's case had become so much more than just an audit. It had become a test of Mira's own convictions, and now she was headed to confront Elias with Veer's offer, knowing that accepting it would mean sealing his fate. And Sela's too if he refused. The weight of her responsibility settled heavily upon her as she made her way down the hallway toward the Roon family's destiny. Mira found Elias in a dingy cafe, nursing a mug of bitter coffee like it was his only friend. His eyes looked sunken, haunted, and Mira knew she had to tread carefully. "Elias," she began, taking a seat across from him without waiting for permission. "Director Veer wants to see you." He jerked upright, spilling some of the coffee onto the stained tablecloth. "What? Why?" "The offer he made me. It's yours too." Mira hesitated, then added, "Free feeling, Elias. All you want, all the time. No more rationing love for Sela. No more debt. Just feel." For a moment, hope flickered in his eyes before dread set in again. "It can't be that simple," he muttered. "There's always a catch." "You know there is." Mira's voice was flat, resigned. "But this one? Director Veer himself is offering it. All you have to do is agree to regular check-ins and never speak of the details of your subscription. In return, Sentiva will pay off all your debts, and Sela's port will be activated permanently." "And what about my daughter? Will she be okay?" "She'll have feeling whenever you do," Mira replied, the words tasting bitter on her tongue. "Whenever you subscribe for her, Sela's port will register the emotion and react accordingly. She'll feel love, guilt, whatever else you pay for." Elias looked at her then, his eyes pleading. "Is that enough? For a child to experience only what someone else buys for them? What about joy or wonder or pain when it hurts. Mira felt a pang in her chest, the first genuine feeling she'd experienced since taking the jailbreak, but she pushed it down hard. She couldn't afford emotions like those now. Sentiva promises they'll monitor and adjust your feelings to prevent emotional overload. Director Ver says this is the only way to ensure Sella's stability and happiness. Elias leaned forward, his hands grasping the table as if he wanted to pull himself through it. But at what cost? I know I'm desperate for love, but is it worth giving up control over my own feelings? Mira couldn't meet his gaze anymore. Instead, she stared down at her own hands, noticing how they shook slightly in her lap. She felt a flicker of something like guilt or regret. But she pushed those thoughts away too. Mira's gaze snapped up to meet his then, a spark of something alive and human flickering in her eyes for just an instant before she reined it back in. Elias looked at her for a long moment before sighing heavily and running his hands through his hair. "I need time," he said finally, standing up from the table. "Time to think about this, to consider the risks." Mira stood too, her mind racing as she processed his response. She knew what Ver wanted him to do. Sign on the dotted line and forget everything else. But Elias, he was considering it. He was weighing the pros and cons of free feeling against the unknown costs of relinquishing control. And Mira couldn't help but wonder if he wasn't right in doing so. Shouldn't they have a choice? In this world of metered emotions, shouldn't parents get to decide what their children felt? When? Figure shrinking into the distance until she was just a dark silhouette against the wet pavement. He couldn't shake the feeling that he'd missed something, some vital piece of information about this woman who had appeared out of nowhere to threaten his daughter's future, and then seemed to offer him salvation instead. What did she want from them? And why should he trust her when Sentiva's promises were so much sweeter? Inside the cab, Sella chattered on excitedly about their new hiding place in the tunnels, completely oblivious to the high-stakes game of cat and mouse they'd been drawn into. Elias listened to her with a detached sense of wonder. This child who had known only rationed affection was now basking in an ocean of freely felt emotion. He couldn't bear the thought of ever taking that away from her again. The cab turned onto a narrow, dimly lit street, and Elias's heart quickened as he caught his first glimpse of Junko's hideout. It looked like every abandoned alleyway in neo-Colvar. Crumbling concrete, flickering neon signs promising cheap thrills and dubious connections. But this was where they'd find safety from Sentiva's reach. As the cab stopped before a rusted metal door with an electronic keypad, Elias reached for his wallet to pay the driver. "Keep it," he said brusquely. "We won't be needing anything else." The man eyed him warily but took the hint and sped off into the night. Elias opened the door and stepped out, Sella already climbing down from her seat in anticipation of adventure. He knelt to help her with her bag and looked up just as Junko emerged from the shadows, a cigarette dangling from her lips. "Welcome to the rat's nest," she said, grinning wickedly. "You're not going anywhere for a while." She led them through the door into darkness, the sound of dripping water echoing off concrete walls. Elias stumbled slightly on the uneven ground and felt Sella's small hand take his, guiding him forward as they descended deeper into the tunnels. Junko stopped at an alcove in the wall, pulling out a small device that looked like it belonged in a dentist's office rather than a clandestine hideout. She waved it over a metal plate set into the concrete and waited for what felt like an eternity before a section of the wall slid open with a hiss of compressed air. They stepped through the doorway into a surprisingly well-lit, if cramped, space filled with makeshift beds, crates of supplies, and an array of electronic gadgetry that Elias couldn't even begin to identify. Junko waved them over to a table in the center of the room, where she'd set out a couple of pre-cooked meals and what looked like a week's worth of news feeds from every channel in neo-Colvar. "This is home now," Junko said, gesturing around the cluttered space. "At least until we can figure something else out." Elias looked at Sella, who was already digging into a meal with gusto. "Eat up," he said, forcing a smile as he sat down beside her. Meal with gusto. He felt the familiar ache in his chest as he realized they were truly cut off from the world above. No more weekly visits to Sentiva, no more illicit love taps. It would be up to them now to survive on their own terms. And yet, as he looked around this makeshift sanctuary, Elias couldn't shake the feeling that they might just stand a chance down here in the dark. With Junko's expertise and Mira's, whatever it was she had to offer, maybe they could fight back against the system that had held them captive for so long. Sela paused mid-bite and looked up at him with those guileless eyes, waiting for him to say something reassuring. Elias smiled, though his heart felt heavy with uncertainty. "We'll be okay," he said softly. "I promise." He turned back to Junko, whose expression had softened ever so slightly as she watched them interact. "Tell us about this, Mira," he asked abruptly. Junko raised an eyebrow but began to speak in her usual rapid-fire style. She explained that Mira was a feeling auditor who'd gone rogue when she discovered the full extent of Sentiva's emotional throttling and its true purpose, not to protect people from their feelings, but to control them and profit from their pain. "She used to be just like me," Junko said bitterly. "A survivor, always looking out for number one. But then something changed her. I don't know what she felt or why, but it's made her reckless." Elias frowned, processing this new information about the woman who'd threatened his daughter's future and now seemed to be their only hope of escaping Sentiva's clutches. "Why would a feeling auditor want to help us?" he asked bluntly. Junko snorted. "She's got her reasons. And I think we're about to find out what they are." As if on cue, the comms device on Junko's belt let out a soft beep, indicating an incoming transmission. "What is it?" Elias asked, feeling his stomach drop with foreboding. Junko looked at him grimly. "It's Mira again." She glanced down at the device and raised her voice slightly. "What do you want?" The response came through clearly despite the crackling static. "I have something you need. Meet me outside the old clock tower in 2 hours. Come alone." There was a moment of silence before Junko clicked off. "Looks like we're about to get our answers," she said, already moving toward the exit. Elias stood up and grabbed Sela's hand again, his mind racing with possibilities. Some terrifying, others. Outside the damp tunnels, neon signs flickered like fireflies along the rain-soaked streets of Neo-Colvar. Elias, Junko, and Sela huddled together under a rusted awning as they waited for Mira to arrive. The girl was quiet, her eyes scanning the dark alleyways that snaked through the towering skyscrapers. Junko checked the comms device in her hand again, then glanced up at Elias with an uncertain expression. "She's late," she said softly. Elias nodded, his jaw clenched. He hadn't expected this meeting to be easy, but he had hoped for a clear plan of escape from Sentiva's grip. Just as they were about to give up and return to the tunnels, a slender figure emerged from the shadows. Mira approached them with quick, purposeful steps, her face obscured by the cowl of her coat. When she stopped in front of them, Elias could see the blue light of her cortical port pulsing weakly behind her left ear. "I brought what you need," she said flatly, holding out a small data pad. It was an official Sentiva archive disk, protected by layers of encryption and firewalls, the kind of access that would allow them to dismantle the corporation's emotional control from within. Junko took it gingerly, as if it might bite. "This is everything?" she asked, scanning the contents of the disk. Mira nodded. "The original trial data on the Overwhelm via signature authorizing the early emotional throttling tests. It proves that Sentiva caused the catastrophe they used to justify their control over our feelings." Elias felt a chill run down his spine as he processed this revelation. The company he'd been forced to rely on for every moment of love and affection toward his daughter was complicit in their suffering and had deliberately engineered it. "What's next?" Junko asked, already planning their strategy. "We can't just broadcast this without a plan." "I've been thinking about that," Mira replied, her voice tinged with an emotion Elias couldn't quite place, determination mixed with something else he didn't recognize in this woman who had once tried to shut down his love for Sela altogether. "The only way to expose Sentiva and give the city back its feelings is to hack into their telemetry core and broadcast the archive data directly into every port in Neo-Colvar." Junko's eyes widened. "That's suicide," she said bluntly. "It might be," Mira admitted, "but it's worth the risk if we can bring down this system for good." She glanced at Elias, her gaze steady as a challenge. "Are you willing to take that chance?" Elias hesitated, his mind torn between the safety of hiding and the possibility of freeing not only himself, but every citizen in Neo-Colvar from emotional bondage. He looked down at Sela, who was watching him intently, this child who had never known a moment of genuine affection until he'd bought an hour of love for her each week. "Yes," Elias said finally, his voice firm despite the trembling in his chest. "Let's do it." Junko nodded, already working on decrypting the datapad and preparing to infiltrate Sentiva's core. Mira pulled back the hood of her coat, revealing a face drained of all color except for the hard determination burning in her eyes. "It's time," she said, and led them into the unknown, leaving behind the only world they'd ever known. One where feeling had been bought and sold like commodities, and love was nothing more than an expensive indulgence. The darkness swallowed them whole as they descended deeper into the tunnels. Junko, leading the way, moved with practiced ease through the shadows, her footsteps light on the damp concrete. Elias clung to Sela's hand, his heart pounding in time with hers as he tried to block out the fear that threatened to overwhelm him. Mira brought up the rear, her mind racing with the weight of their plan and the risks they were taking. She couldn't shake the feeling that they were running out of time, that Ver or his agents would catch wind of their intentions at any moment and snuff them out like the sparks they were. As they navigated a particularly narrow stretch, Junko paused to examine a rusted metal door set into the wall. "We're close," she whispered, her voice muffled by the layer of grime coating it from years of neglect. "This should lead directly into Sentiva's core." She reached out and keyed in a sequence on an old-fashioned keypad. The lock clicked open with an audible hiss, and Junko pushed the door wide. Beyond lay a labyrinthine corridor of gleaming white tiles and sterile air, the antithesis to the grimy tunnels they'd left behind. Elias exchanged a nervous glance with Mira before stepping across the threshold with Sela held tight against him. Junko followed close behind, her hand resting on the grip of the weapon sheathed at her hip. They moved cautiously through Sentiva's underbelly, avoiding cameras and sensors that dotted the walls like mechanical eyes. Junko knew this place like the back of her hand. She'd spent countless hours mapping out its inner workings for just such an occasion as this. As they turned a corner, Mira spotted a bank of monitors displaying real-time feeds from across Neo-Colvar. Her heart skipped a beat. If Veer or his agents were monitoring these feeds, they would surely detect the broadcast she'd unleashed earlier that morning. The thought sent a chill down her spine, but she pushed it aside. They had to get this done before their chance slipped away. Junko led them onward until they reached a set of heavy metal doors adorned with Sentiva's corporate sigil. With a quick glance back at Elias and Sela, she pulled out a datapad and began typing furiously against the lock. Sweat beaded on her brow as she worked, but finally the mechanism cycled open. Beyond lay a vast chamber filled with rows upon rows of servers humming softly, their blinking lights casting an eerie glow over the space. At the far end stood Ver's private office, a fortress of glass and steel that looked out onto Neo-Colvar like a monarch surveying his kingdom. Mira felt a surge of dread at the sight. She knew exactly what awaited them inside those walls, but they couldn't turn back now, not when they were this close to exposing Sentiva's true crimes to the world. "You ready for this?" Junko asked quietly, her eyes locked on Mira with an unspoken understanding. Mira took a deep breath and nodded. "Let's do it," she whispered back, steeling herself for what was to come. Together, they slipped into the heart of Sentiva, their footsteps echoing ominously through the cavernous chamber as they moved inexorably toward the truth and whatever lay waiting on the other side. The tension in her shoulders eased slightly as Elias finally relaxed his death grip on Sela's hand. She smiled at him, squeezing his fingers gently before letting go to continue leading Junko into the heart of Sentiva's underbelly. The mission had been their plan from the start, broadcast that raw feeling across Neo-Colvar so everyone could taste freedom. if only for 90 seconds. But now, with Vere's private chambers within reach, everything felt different. Elias glanced back at his daughter, who was watching him with wide, curious eyes. He smiled down at her, wanting to reassure her, but not trusting himself to speak without breaking down. Instead, he reached into his pocket and pulled out a small object, a crystal pendant he'd bought on one of their ill-fated trips to the surface markets. He fastened it around Sella's neck, tucking the small gemstone into the folds of her shirt. "Keep this safe for me," he whispered urgently, his heart pounding in his chest. "I want you to have something that's mine." He knew it was a ridiculous gesture. Nothing about him could ever truly be hers, but he didn't care. He just wanted to give her something tangible to hold on to. Sella looked up at him questioningly, and Elias felt a pang of guilt for not being able to explain why this mattered so much to him. But before he could try to articulate his feelings, Mira turned back toward them, her eyes narrowed with concern. "We need to move," she said quietly, gesturing toward Vere's office at the far end of the chamber. "Junko's almost in. I can see the data streaming across her pad." Elias nodded numbly and fell into step beside Sella, leading her deeper into the belly of Sentiva as they waited for the bombshell that would shake Neo-Kolvar to its very core. The silence between them was oppressive, weighted with unspoken fears and uncertainties. Elias couldn't bear to look at Mira, not after what he'd seen in her eyes, a depth of emotion and conviction he'd never encountered before. It terrified him. It made him feel small and inadequate compared to her cold, calculated strength. But as they crossed the threshold into Vere's office, all those feelings were eclipsed by something far more primal: rage. Elias spotted Vere sitting behind his desk, a smug smile on his face as he watched them enter. "Welcome," Vere said, rising from his chair. It made Elias want to rip the man's face off. "What is it you think you've accomplished here?" Vere asked, his voice smooth as a salesman's but edged with condescension. He gestured at Mira's pad, where Junko's broadcast tap data streamed in real time across the screen. Mira stood tall and unmoving beside Elias, her eyes locked on Vere. "We've exposed your company for what it is," she said, her voice cold and clipped as a blade. "A parasite feeding off human misery." She stepped forward, her shoulders squaring in challenge. "The overwhelm wasn't an epidemic of despair. It was a reaction to your early trials on the population's emotional systems." Vere chuckled softly, the sound like a snake slithering through tall grass. "You're misinformed," he said. "We did what had to be done. We put humanity back in control." He glanced at Elias, his gaze flicking over Sella. "Consider this man and his daughter. They were just one of thousands of families trapped by the economic realities of your society. Feeling was a luxury they couldn't afford." Elias felt his face heat with shame and anger. Vere's words struck like barbs into his very soul. "We took away people's ability to feel," she said, "and then we monetized those feelings to keep the poor in line and the rich basking in a false sense of security. You've created a society that values profit over compassion." Vere shrugged, his smile never wavering. "We gave them choice, the freedom not to feel if they can't afford it." He leaned back against his desk, steepling his fingers as he regarded Mira with an air of superiority. "You, on the other hand, seem determined to force your own moral code onto the population. How do you propose we dismantle Sentiva without causing chaos and destruction?" Mira's gaze never wavered from Vere's face. "We can't undo what's been done," she said, "but we can make sure it doesn't happen again." She turned to Junko, who stood silent beside her pad, her eyes intent on the data streaming across the screen. "Junko?" Mira said, a note of urgency in her voice. Junko nodded almost imperceptibly and reached into her jacket pocket, pulling out a small, sleek device that looked like an upgraded version of Elias's bootleg tap. "What is that?" Vere asked, his tone wary for the first time. "It's a broadcast hub," Mira said, her eyes never leaving Vere's face. "With this, we can spread Junko's hacked data directly into every citizen's port in the city, for 90 seconds at least." "You can't," he said, but there was doubt in his voice now. "Oh, but we can," Mira smiled. a cold, calculated thing that made Elias's blood run cold. She glanced at Junko, who nodded once more and pressed the hub into her hand. Without another word, Mira strode forward toward Vere's desk, while Elias watched in horror as she activated the device and held it up like a talisman. The room seemed to vibrate with tension, the air thickening, the silence heavy with anticipation. Then, suddenly, every port in Neo-Kolvar came alive, as if 1,000 hidden pianos struck their first notes at once. Beside him, Sela looked up with wide eyes, a small smile playing on her lips. "Daddy?" she whispered, as if trying to make sense of it all. Elias opened his mouth to answer, but no words came. He was drowning in a sea of other people's feelings, and he didn't know how to stay afloat. In the midst of that maelstrom, Mira stood tall and unyielding, her eyes never leaving Vere's face as she held the broadcast hub aloft like a beacon. Elias wondered if she could see past the man's polished facade to the cold calculation behind those eyes, or if it was only he who sensed the monster lurking there. Whatever her thoughts, Mira's actions were decisive. She pressed the button on the device, and for 90 seconds Neo-Kolvar felt everything it had been denied for so long. Elias clung to Sela as wave after wave of emotion crashed over them both, and when it finally subsided, leaving only a vague sense of emptiness in its wake, he knew that nothing would ever be the same again. Mira lowered her hand, her expression unreadable as she turned toward Junko. "It's done," she said, her voice flat and devoid of emotion. Beside him, Elias felt his own feelings drain away like water down a sinkhole, leaving him empty, numb, and lost in a sea of uncertainty. He glanced at Sela, but her face was a blank slate once more, her eyes wide and curious as she looked up at him with that small, perfect smile. "Daddy?" she asked again, and Elias felt his heart twist in his chest, because he knew they would have to live without love for a long time yet. But Mira had set something loose in Neo-Kolvar tonight, a cancer of love that might never heal. Sela's voice broke through Elias's daze, her small hand reaching out to him in the dim tunnel light. He felt Junko's eyes on them both, a flicker of something. Tenderness? In their depths before the dealer turned back to Mira. "It worked," Junko said, her words ringing off the damp concrete walls of the drainage pipe. "The tap's live. They can't track us here." Mira stood motionless, her face a mask of indifference as she stared down at the device clutched in her hand, the same one that had unleashed 90 seconds of raw feeling across Neo-Kolvar just hours before. "The broadcast will be traced," Mira said finally, her voice still devoid of emotion. "We've bought ourselves some time, but not much." "Long enough," Elias replied, scooping Sela up into his arms as he stood, trying to shield her from the uncertainty looming over them all. "Long enough for us to disappear." Junko's lips curled in a grim smile. "You're willing to run?" Elias hesitated before meeting Junko's gaze. "I have no choice," he admitted quietly. "As long as I owe Sentiva, they can take Sela away from me at any moment." Mira's eyes narrowed, her silence speaking volumes about the lengths she'd gone to in order to give the city that brief taste of freedom. "We'll need food and supplies," Junko said briskly, already moving toward the tunnel mouth, "and a safe place to lay low until we can figure out our next move." In silence, Elias followed Mira and Junko out into the rain-soaked streets, their footsteps echoing off the towering structures of Neo-Kolvar's vertical megacity. The city that had been so still and serene before now thrummed with a new energy, a palpable sense of restlessness, as citizens struggled to reconcile their newly unlocked feelings with the bleak reality they'd always known. As Elias looked down at Sela in his arms, he felt a pang of sorrow for all those who would soon be re-throttled back into emotional compliance. The broadcast feeling flood had been a temporary reprieve at best, and an act of defiance that could not go unpunished. The group moved swiftly through the streets, their destination unknown as they sought to evade Sentiva's ever-watchful eye. Elias glanced over his shoulder once, half expecting to see agents closing in. But for now, at least, They were free to move unseen among the crowds, and that fragile freedom was all he had to cling to. They reached an abandoned warehouse on the outskirts of town, its windows boarded up, and its entrance guarded by a pair of Junko's makeshift barricades. Inside, the space was dimly lit but surprisingly clean, with stacks of non-perishable food and bottled water lining the walls. In the center of the room, Junko had rigged up a small campfire, its warmth and light a welcome respite from the chill of the rain-soaked streets outside. "Make yourselves at home," Junko said, dropping onto a crate and lighting a cigarette. "We'll figure out what to do next in the morning." Elias sank down beside Sella on another stack of crates, feeling the weight of their uncertain futures settling heavily upon him. He looked up to find Mira standing in the doorway, her eyes still devoid of emotion as she watched them settle into their new hiding place. For a long moment, Elias simply stared back at her, trying to fathom what thoughts lurked behind those cold, clinical eyes, returned to its usual mask of indifference. Without another word, she turned and disappeared back into the rainy night, leaving Elias alone with his daughter and the dealer who had helped him escape, each lost in their own thoughts about what they'd done and where it would all lead from here.